I think a lot of my friends of the same generation that are close to me, we share that sentiment as well, that there is something in the air. There's this gloom. And having lost a country before, we're kind of sensitive to the tripwires that we see being tripping, and we start to watch carefully. Children of the next generation, they don't know why that sense of paranoia is so strong among us. But I think if you have lost a country before, you've seen society completely turn upside down and very quickly, it's not beyond the imagination that it can happen here. That a scenario where you shut down the Constitution, you do away with judges, so the executive branch is the law, then the army can be brought in the state of the emergency to squelch the opposition.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover, with an eye on Trump and Musk's America. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015. Today, I'm hosting alone. My new collaborator, Maria Repnikova, can't make it, but she'll be on our weekly Getting By Zoom session this Friday at 4 p.m. US Eastern Time. Please subscribe at rhymingchaos.com to get notifications, or even better, support us and take out a paid subscription. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Lam to the show. Andrew is a Vietnamese-American journalist and writer. He's the author of Perfume Dreams, Reflections on the Vietnamese Diaspora, which won the PEN American Beyond Margins Award in 2006. He has also reported as a journalist from around the US and Asia and written many essays and a number of other books, including a wonderful collection of short fiction, Stories from the Edge of the Sea, published in March this year. Andrew spent his early childhood in Vietnam, but fled with his family to the United States after Saigon famously fell on April 30th, 1975, almost exactly 50 years ago. Andrew, welcome to Rhyming Chaos.
Thank you so much.
Andrew, let's set the scene. Tell us about your early childhood in Vietnam and your father.
Yeah. Well, I have a particular type of childhood in the sense that it was not what most Vietnamese would remember, because my father was a very famous general during the war. And so my early childhood, including riding helicopters, over battlefields that had just been fought a month earlier or so. It was a childhood protected by guards at the gate, but also a very rich childhood because my father was a very educated man. He spoke fluent French and my mom was well-read. So it was a kind of weird combination between literature and war. And so it was a beautiful, tumultuous, scary, and full of wonderment childhood during the war, and especially during the scary parts of the war. But I was only 11 and a half plus when I left Vietnam. So it was a childhood that somehow seemed to me from this distance as if another lifetime ago, and a kind of world that seemed to have disappeared so long ago that I would even feel as if I have reincarnated from that moment, because it's really hard to imagine myself as that child anymore because it's so long ago.
Let's talk about the days leading up to the fall of Saigon. What are your memories of April 1975 or the weeks before that? And what was the atmosphere in your last days of Saigon?
There was a lot of panic. There were a lot of people trying to find different ways out, because after the New Year, Lunar New Year, that was happening in like late January of 1975, we all kind of knew in our blood, in our bones, that country was lost. And so back then, my father and my mother started writing letters to my brother, who was a foreign student in the US. They were saying, whatever we tell you after the war ended, don't believe us, because then we will be writing to you under duress. And if we tell you to come home from the US, don't ever come home, because we want you to survive, even if we perish. There was already this sense of impending doom in the early months of 1975. Even the kids in school, I was in 6th grade, talk about suicide because they didn't want to live under communism. And I remember one of my closest friends brought a bottle of poison to school to show us what he and his family would do if the communists came into Saigon. And I was thinking, what would we do? My sister was a pianist, and so there was a Korean teacher who taught piano in Saigon. And my mom was so desperate that he said, well, what if we pretend that you and I are husband and wife so that we can take you and the kids out at least to save you? And she was so desperate that she thought about it, because even though she was married to my father, she thought, how else were we going to escape from Vietnam? There was a kind of anything would go, anything could help, we would take it. We went to Vũng Tàu, which is a beach town about 80 kilometers from Saigon, because there were rumors that American ships were coming in late March to pick up well-placed families like mine to America. And of course, that never panned out, but we spent 2 days out there waiting for the ships to come in, and the women were taking diamonds out of their rings so that they stuff it into wax and then pretended that's where they put the needles and thread so that they didn't know that there was diamond hidden inside the wax. I can imagine that's what Russia must have been like at the end of the Nikolai era. But it felt that way, like, how do we get out? What do we do to get out? There was sheer panic, and the dollar, which was trading at this low amount, and suddenly within a day, triple, and then next day, quadruple, and no one was willing to sell dollars for Vietnamese dong. So money was like flowing out on the street with no value whatsoever. So yeah, I remember the panic very well, because 11, you have very good memory of that time.
That must have been so frightening. We're recording this on May 19th. It's just over, as I mentioned, just over 50 years after the fall of Saigon. But it's only 4 months after an event that future historians may remember as the fall of Washington, D.C., the inauguration of Donald Trump for the second time. I felt in the week after January 20, the rapidity with which these executive orders came down and the changes, and Elon Musk's team going in and hacking apart government departments, and people I know in D.C. talking about the sense of fear. It made me think of a city after an invading army had arrived. Did you at all have any feelings about the speed with which the incoming administration began to dismantle the government? Did that remind you at all of the last days of Saigon, or was that just my projection?
Well, I think for Vietnam, a lot of people have already lived in the North before the war ended. In 1954, the country split in half. And then there were practically 2 million refugees from the North who fled from under Ho Chi Minh to the South when the country split in half. So they knew exactly what it was like to live under authoritarian regimes, persecution, getting rid of intellectuals, gulags, and that sort of thing. And my mother is from the North, so she and her family side knew what was going to happen. So it was not as if she didn't have an experience of that. So that made it even more panicky, impending doom feeling. And so I think that for us, though, in the US, we never had that kind of authoritarian regime, even though we kind of know from watching movies or from reading literature of other countries that sense of doom really didn't really exist until this time around, because when I was writing about the first Trump administration, I was expecting that using my mother's memories and what happened to Vietnam after I left. But I think back then there were more adults in the room to hold him back. And this time around, I think he got the carte blanche to do whatever he wants. And with the experience of how he didn't get the things he wanted in the first time around, that clearly there was a much more organized, planned out idea of what to do when they come back in power. And you can see it like at the speed to which they try to dismantle all the establishments that hold up this country, democracy.
Yes, I know. So to go back to your story, Saigon fell, you were forced to flee. Can you talk about your flight from Vietnam and your family's arrival in the United States?
Yeah, we were lucky because in the Vietnamese communities here in the US, when you get together, people often ask this as a way to measure how far you come from that past. And they always say, when did you come to America? And if someone say, oh, I came in 79 or 80 something, so then they assume automatically you're a boat person, because that's how you escape during that Cold War, is you're on a boat, rickety boat, hoping for a chance to survive. But if I tell you that, oh, I left 2 days before the end of the war, then everyone knows I flew out, because people managed to fly out until the 28th of April. And when I left on a cargo plane full of refugees to Subic Bay, to the Philippines, 2 hours after I left, they started bombing the airport of Saigon, the Tân Sơn Nhất airport. And that's why planes couldn't take off anymore. And that's why helicopters have to be employed to pick up people, because the airport had been completely ruined. And so after that, we spent a week in Guam. From the Philippines, we went to Guam. And then from Guam, we waited for news whether or not we would be allowed into the United States, because there was a sort of resistance in the U.S. about letting South Vietnamese refugees coming into America. And it was Gerald Ford who pushed for it, and that's how we got to the U.S. But the debate was raging on while I was walking on the windblown tent city of Guam refugee camp, waiting for news. And 2 days after we arrived in that camp, of course, the news came that Saigon fell. And I remember the adults started weeping. And you can hear almost like this collective wailing in that tent full of people. And a lot of people were still wearing civilian clothes that they would wear to go to work, because they fled with what they were wearing, you know?
Literally the shirts on their back.
Yeah. And so they looked like they were just going to work. Some people are still in slack shirt, or women in the ao dai dresses, and they're like sitting there on an army cart, not knowing what to do with their lives. And people were weeping because clearly going back was impossible and going forward was not known, right? So we were waiting just for news of something. What happened to your relatives we left behind, and your cousin, your husband, your wife, whatever. And so there is this total sense of sheer panic and despair.
And then from Guam, how did you get to the U.S.?
Well, then, the U.S., the only way for them to process such large mass of population coming into America, and I don't think the U.S. ever became that generous again since the Vietnamese population, really, because we certainly don't see it with Iraqi, and we don't see it with Afghan refugees.
Oh, we only see it right now with my countrymen, white South Africans, 50 of them.
African whites, yeah. But that's the only largesse that we can see. But during my time, it was a profoundly generous country that took us in. And one of the reasons why Vietnamese remains so Republican or loyal to the Republican Party, it was because it was Ford and who opened up the doors. And then later on, they fell in love with Reagan, who stood against communism, which is what they also stood for. And so then that was a sense of loyalty to the Republican Party. But we got resettled into another refugee camp called Pendleton near San Diego, which is another army area. And then it was from there that they called out to normal, regular citizens to come in and sponsor Vietnamese family out of the camp. And one of the reasons why Orange County has the largest Vietnamese population in the U.S., actually in the world outside of Vietnam, is because of Camp Pendleton was the largest clearinghouse for refugees coming in at that time. And Orange County was the hotbed of conservative Republicans who thought we shouldn't have abandoned South Vietnam, and where Nixon is from originally. So then there was a lot of conservative families that came in and sponsored Vietnamese out of those camps, and that's where Little Saigon grew. My family is a little bit different because my mom's younger sister was married to a career diplomat working for the Vietnamese consulate in the U.S. And so we were in San Francisco. And so she came down and picked us up, and we flew from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And I think my family, about maybe May 13th, like a week ago, would be the 50th years of my life in America and in San Francisco. So we landed in San Francisco. We were the first refugee family to come, and that's where we resettled, and that's where I grew up.
In April 2001, on the 30th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, you published a really interesting essay called 3 Decades After the Fall of Saigon, My Father's War. Here's a quote from it. There were two main causes for the fall: the lack of a clear mission for the U.S. armed forces fighting there, and the hostility of the U.S. media toward the war, my father said, his voice rising a little. The media here, for one reason or another, try to present it under the most unfavorable angles. Example, ample coverage of the execution of a Viet Cong sapper by General Nguyen Ngoc Loan. Sorry, my pronunciation is not good. During the Viet Cong Tet offensive, with the famous picture of the pistol to the head, while the mass murder of civilians in Hue by the Viet Cong was hardly mentioned. This resulted in an increasing anti-war movement in the United States and the cut of military aid to South Vietnam. This is probably a difficult passage for many American liberals to read. But maybe it offers a clue to our current news media, if I may be permitted, clusterfuck in the United States, in the sense of liberal media that doesn't tell the whole story. Does that make any sense to you? Because that passage somehow struck me as resonating with our current moment, even though it's about a completely different...
Yeah. Well, I'm a journalist, but I wouldn't call myself a liberal media journalist necessarily, because even though I write for a lot of supposedly liberal media, it's because I'm really interested in the depth of a story rather than that glib headline so that you can get people stoked and emotional. For instance, the General Long who executed that sapper, the reason why he did it, although he shouldn't have, was that the sapper had killed an entire family, or had ordered the killing of an entire family of one of the officer that was his underling, including the wife. They shot the wife and wouldn't let her die and let her scream for hours. The 3-4 kids that were there were all shot to death, and the only one kid that survived, became an American general later in the US, by the way, an admiral, was that this man had ordered several series of massacres, right? But the problem with shooting someone like that without any context is that it just seems so, the picture doesn't really tell the story behind the story. Even the photographer of that picture later on said that he regretted that photo went around without a story, right? Because then it just gives the world this sense of, oh, the South is cruel, right? But in fact, war is cruel and everyone involved is guilty, not innocent. You know what I mean? But we don't get the full story because there are political leaning, and the media really didn't want to dig deep on that. The same way as we look at the My Lai massacre as the story. But when we look at the several thousand people, the innocent people really, in Hue that was murdered in 1972, in 68, and that story doesn't get play. You know what I mean? Because there is a certain point of view, and that's going to be played up. And then there is this thing called the sin of omission, where other point of view get played down so that people agree with your assessment rather than knowing the whole full picture. And the right is guilty of the same stuff. You know what I mean? But what I'm interested in the fair and balanced narrative where, okay, so that's why he did what he did, rather than he's cruel. That, in fact, there's a story behind the story.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think in war, you can make anybody look terrible because war consists of terrible things.
Yeah.
So not too much later, that was before 9/11, that essay. And then in December 2002, so after 9/11, you published an essay titled Letter to a Vietnamese Cousin, Should You Come to America? Let me quote a couple of lines from it. What is it like to be an immigrant in America these days? Is it still worth coming? And is the dream still possible? A few lines on, you wrote, yet it's undeniable. The nation of immigrants is turning its back on immigrants once more. How do you feel now in 2025, looking back on that essay?
Yeah, I mean, post 9/11, there's a lot of effort to shut down the constitutions. This is not the first time when there's an effort to override law in order to control the population. The Patriot Act was an effort to say, we don't have to have a search warrant to go into your house. We don't have to get the Justice Department to agree or the judges to write this thing because this is a state of emergency. But it led to a lot of injustices as well. I wrote about how there was a girl that was reported upon in the dorm because she was telling someone on the phone on how to play this video game where you go to another level and you dig and you get this bomb and you put it in some kind of pocket and let it explode until you go through this wall to get to another level in the video game. Well, someone else walked by her dorm room and heard the word bomb and called the FBI because after Patriot Act, anyone who deemed suspicious, is automatic for reporting to the authorities. So there was another case where an Pakistani family who decided to have a wedding at home in the East Bay, Oakland, and they were cooking curry. And the neighbors called the police thinking that they were making toxic chemical to kill people. So, and then of course they get investigated. You know what I mean? I mean, that sort of thing became norm, right? The word bomb became like a key word to get somebody. So already free speech back then was under threat. And you say word bomb at the airport, even now you're in trouble, right? So things started to reduce about what rights you have And so increasingly, what used to be the idea of the country that allowed immigrants to come in, the country that fought for human rights, and the definition of what a refugee is and what rights they have begin to disappear slowly as we become more suspicious of the world.
Right. So we shouldn't really be surprised by the authoritarian turn the country's taking right now, because it's been happening for, nearly 3 decades.
We do swing pretty far to the other side. I mean, if you go back to World War II, Japanese who were second and third generation here were rounded up and put in a re-education camp or internment camp, and they lost their livelihood. The farmers lost their land because they couldn't even pay tax, because they were stuck in a camp. And that was like how many thousands? I don't know the actual number. But so then a generation of Japanese, second, third, fourth generation of Japanese in America by then, were all rounded up and put in a camp because Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, right? And that's the thing. It's like, that's actually unconstitutional. But in time of crisis, people have a tendency to say, well, we can't afford to be free with a rule of law when we have this national crisis at hand. But usually when it's used, the result is cruelty and injustice.
Yeah. I suppose what feels different to me this time is that there wasn't a crisis. The crisis has been completely manufactured from my point of view.
And I think the crisis can be further manufactured to the point where a state of emergency can be declared. So then you can bring in your military troops and, you rounded up the opposition and that sort of thing, which is sort of textbook authoritarian practices. So, I mean, we can see examples of that in many countries like Turkey and so on.
Yeah. The first time, as far as I understand it, the first time you went back to Vietnam after leaving as an 11-year-old was in 1991, working as a journalist. Can you talk about that trip a little and perhaps start with your conversation with the passport stamping agent guy about how you talk about April 30th in Vietnam?
Yeah, sure. And, this is why I find the Vietnamese community here have a lot of parallel history with the Cuban population in Miami. It's because we mostly were not immigrants. We were refugees. We fled en masse. The Cuban left before us, but we also left because of a revolution or a defeated war. And we carried the wound of loss. Unlike, say, a South Korean who sell his house and go to the U.S. as an immigrant and buy his ticket and say goodbye to grandma and open a shop in the U.S., we didn't want to leave. We were forced out, right? And so we carried this wound of having lost and the pain of that explosion, so that when we got to the U.S., April 30th became a date, what we call Ngày Mất Nước, which is national loss, because that's actually when we lost our homeland. For the North, who came south and took over, they call it National Liberation Day because that's when they won and they took the land. And so clearly there's two different opinions about what that date means from history point of view. And the U.S. certainly also see it as a kind of mark of shame of its engagement and its failure. But for the diaspora and for certainly my own family, it's really a day of loss for a long, long time. We think about the people we left behind, the home we had, the way of life that we had, and, a language, a routine, a tradition, all that's gone because we became American, right? So 50 years on, there's still a lot of wounds. There's still a lot of trauma that's still there. So when I came back, and back then there were very few people coming back because the Cold War just ended like in 89. And there were exactly 4 flights into Hanoi at that time when I was there a day. So the custom officer was like, look at my passport. I was really perplexed, So when did you leave? And I say, yeah, on the 28th or the 2 days before National Defeat Day. And he say, when is that? And I say, the 28th of April. So he said, oh, do you mean National Liberation? And I had to laugh because I'm like, oh my God, I have completely forgotten that there is another point of view from the world I came from. But then it makes for an interesting way of seeing because, history is so complex. And some people see, say, a Trump win is a liberation day for this country, right? And some people see like this is the beginning of the end of democracy. And so everyone have their own logic and their own way of looking. But I think that there are ways in which we could, if say, let that young man and I sat down and have coffee, we could share stories, right? We could say, oh, this is why we see it this way. And they could see it the other way, right? They fought to liberate the South, whatever, right? And so there are ways in which we could bridge that gap with stories.
And do you think, because you've lived there since then and you've visited a lot, do you feel as though the efforts to bridge that are successful, or is it common for Vietnamese of your generation to be able to go back and to sort of in some way make peace with the way things are now?
Yeah, I think people in general don't buy into the communist propaganda, especially city people getting more sophisticated. They're not allowed to have access to information outside the country, but it's just for show, because if you have VPN, you can read anything overseas anyway. Like Vietnamese-American writing are not allowed to be read like in Vietnamese media here in the US. But if you have VPN, you can just override and read whatever you want, right? And so there's been cases where young people in Vietnam got punished for doing research on the Vietnam War and didn't know about that they're not supposed to use the Vietnamese-American version, right? Because this has happened years ago. Vietnam's population went from 37 million to 102, right, million. So you're talking about a large population that have moved on from that juncture. It's been 50 years. And so when they do research, they just think they're doing research. But in fact, the government didn't want them to access another version of history. And yet young people don't have a strong opinion about most of these things because to them it's all pages of history.
Right. I haven't lived in Vietnam, but I've traveled quite extensively, and it felt quite a lot like China to me in the sense they're both run by communist parties that maintain quite strict authoritarian control, but basically stay out of people's personal lives and businesses. If you don't get too rich or powerful, if you don't get into politics or activism, and if you're in the media or arts or cultural fields, you obviously have to really watch what you say and what you do. Does that seem about right? And can you describe what it's like to be in Vietnam now as a writer?
There's a big difference. Is that China is so big that it created its own bubble, its own internet. It's what is Huawei and whatever the
WeChat, its own app.
Yeah. Label. Vietnam does not have that. Vietnam allows all the social media form to exist in Vietnam. So when Facebook came in, within a year, 40% of the population were on Facebook. Vietnam has a large population overseas, like 4 or 5 million people. The communication between that 9,500 million plus that 5 million overseas is constant. And then now Vietnam allow all kind of travel. So Vietnamese fly to the US, they fly to Canada, see their relatives. So they know all kind of system exists. They know what freedom exists like in the US, freedom of speech and so on. So it's very hard for the government of Vietnam to sort of sell the propaganda of the virtue of communism. They themselves don't even know what that is anymore, right? They don't know what communism really means. They say socialist paradise, but what does that mean? Because everything is capitalistic. You don't have money, you can go to medical care, dental care, school. All of that has to be paid for out of pocket. So what socialism is there? If you want to move up in the world, you have to pay corruption money in different ways and stuff. So it's all money oriented. And so when they talk about the virtue of communism, it's to deaf ears. So it's very hard for them to sell an idea of why you should be a communist member. So China at least used patriotism or whatever it is against the US or the need to take Taiwan as part of its narrative of why they have to stick together. In Vietnam, the only thing they fear is like China invasion, really. So it's almost like, oh yeah, the two systems are similar, except for Vietnamese don't like Chinese. And they're terrified of China taking over. And Vietnam is actually socially a lot more open to me than China because of that access to the outside world.
Right. That is an interesting angle because, in some ways, China is also very open. People can travel a lot. The internet, I think, is much more tightly controlled than in Vietnam, but people travel. There's a huge diaspora population, which also has a lot of exchange. But perhaps they're a lot more sort of strict in terms of controlling, access to information within China.
Yeah.
But there's another factor that I think is similar to Vietnam, which is the sense that, not very young people, but anyone who is a little bit younger than us, anyone who's like 40 or so or older, remembers being very poor as a child, whereas urban Chinese now have a living standard that is, in some cases better than the United States in certain aspects. And I think that it has done a great deal to kind of sell the Communist Party to the population, even if they don't believe the ideology. How does that compare with Vietnam?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there is no intellectual conversation about what communism means, but there is a kind of unwritten contract between the state and its people. And so when you read the states and news media, they never really talk about what communism means, but they say South Korea just invested $500 million to hire 4,000 more people in the so-so province. US is bringing da-da-da, and that the country's GDP is growing by 5. And you see that constantly. It's as if somehow economic progress is a reason for being in power.
Right.
But by that same token, because it's a kind of singular contract idea, what if you fail that contract?
Right.
Well, when you don't have a patriotism or a nationalistic movement and all you have is like, okay, just leave us alone and we have 7% growth a year. What if it's negative too, right?
Right.
Then what reason would you have to say that you should be in power?
Yeah. I mean, China faces that to some extent too, but I think you're right that the sort of patriotic education is much stronger and more effective. So I could see China having economic difficulties and the Communist Party managing to somehow turn it to its advantage. You've talked about and written about how in many ways your generation has done really well in the United States. Many of you have really prospered and have had very good lives. But you are also vulnerable in this country in some ways. And can you talk about that a little bit? And perhaps you can tell the story of the Vietnamese biochemistry student and the Vietnam vet from your collection, The Edge of the Sea, which somehow to me really encapsulated a feeling that I think is important to understand.
Well, so in my other life, I wear a fiction hat, as a writer, and I get in the lives of people I know or people I think I know, imagine lives that run parallel history. And the one theme that I am fascinated with is how do you deal with having moved from a completely different setting to another and adjust to it within your own lifetime. People who grew up in a rice field planting rice, next thing you know, end up in Silicon Valley putting chips in computers. They jumped over the industrial revolution to information technology in a few years. So there are a lot of disruption in lives. And then you try to make it to, and adjust to the new world. You adjust to living the modern life in the new language and adjusting to the way of life here. But sometimes the trauma, that memory, the loss come back up. And sometimes it just erupts. And so in my fiction sometimes, or oftentimes, depending which stories you read, it suddenly showed itself. And then what your trajectory of your life suddenly get sort of bulldozed or sidelined because you're confronting with a past that hadn't been fully dealt with. So in the case, the story that you mentioned, this kid is at Berkeley thinking he's going to be pre-med, he's doing well, dating a Caucasian girl and thinking, oh, his life's good, right? He's acing his class. But he was a broke person. His family suffered. And then there's this Vietnam vet on the street of Berkeley. And they got into an argument and the guy took out an ear that he said he took it from a Viet Cong, during the war. And this kid is like shocked and didn't know what to do because all the things that he had thought was of the past, hidden and gone or sank into darkness, suddenly right there in the street under sunlight. And so his life suddenly gets disrupted in a way that he hadn't expected. And I think in some way, a lot of us, especially 1.5 generation like mine, still are struggling to deal with that past in some ways. And sometimes you seem to have like a good life, fabulous life, and then something happened, right? And then somehow the trauma of the past rear its ugly head and then things happen. Certainly I can tell that happened with people close to me that ended up in divorce and domestic violence and so on and mental illness. But there's a lot of people who suffer from things that they couldn't talk about in the past. And they had to put it all to rest in order to adjust to American life. But in fact, they don't always sleep. Sometimes they wake up and shake you.
Yeah. How do you feel in Trump's America now? Because, personally, I grew up in South Africa under apartheid, very comfortable life. But this constant feeling that something could go really wrong. It was either rumors at my school that black people were going to rise up and slit all our throats one night, or, the idea that the apartheid government would get much more repressive and that English speakers or anyone who expressed views against apartheid might get arrested. We were supposed to go to the army. And then I lived in China where, I also had a very comfortable life in China, but I often had this feeling that things could go really wrong really quickly. I know still people who are behind bars for ridiculous reasons. And this time, I didn't feel that to me in the first Trump administration, but this time now, I suddenly feel that sense of menace and of risk and of danger has returned. Like, I feel as though I don't know what could happen and something bad could happen. Do you feel like that? And can you talk about that a little bit?
I feel that. And I think a lot of my friends of the same generation that are close to me, we share that sentiment as well, that there is something in the air. There's this gloom. And having lost a country before, we're kind of sensitive to the tripwires that we see being tripping. And we start to watch carefully. Children of the next generation, they don't know why that sense of paranoia is so strong among us. But I think if you have lost a country before, you've seen society completely turn upside down and very quickly. It's not beyond the imagination that it can happen here. That a scenario where you shut down the Constitution, you do away with judges, so the executive branch is the law, then the army can be brought in the state of the emergency to squelch the opposition and then declare a year of dictatorship where you just put everyone in power that are, your underling to rule. I'm not saying that this country would end up obedient that way, because I'm sure there will be resistance of all sorts, but I don't think it's beyond our imagination that scenario could happen.
Yeah, I know. That's a big part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast, is to try and kind of work through that feeling and what it means, and also to somehow ring the alarm bell for some of my American friends who I think don't know how bad things can get when things go bad in the world. To return to something that you sort of raised earlier, you were talking about support in the Vietnamese community for the Republicans because of the generosity with which you were treated and the anti-communist credentials of the Republicans. How about Trump? How much support is there for Trump in the Vietnamese-American community?
Well, Trump was very popular, oddly enough, in Vietnam as well as half the population here. They saw him as a strong man. And I think one of the major thing is that Vietnam sees Trump as the right person to put China in its place. And so for Vietnamese to see Trump like hitting China hard is very gratifying. What they didn't expect was that Trump hitting Vietnam just as hard, with the 46% tariff raise.
Yeah.
The problem with Vietnam is that it is sort of, Vietnamese are saying, you catch fish with both hands, while, the people are fearful of China because it's right next door. It also does a lot of business with China. And one of the reasons why it gets hit so hard is that a lot of Chinese products get transferred to Vietnam, relabeled, and then sold to the US and elsewhere as Vietnamese products, and therefore avoiding the tariff imposed upon China. And of course, America knows that. The US government certainly knows that. And so it's not a big surprise that it called Vietnam out on it. But the Vietnamese people were shocked because in the sense of but I thought he only hated China. But I told my cousin in Vietnam who love Trump, and I say, you know what? If someone hates a Chinese and you sit on a bus in Los Angeles, he doesn't go on the bus and hit and Chinese only because you don't look any different.
You can't tell the difference.
And then they never thought of it that way because, of course, they're from a homogenous society, right?
Yes.
So they perceive like Chinese are Chinese, Vietnamese are Vietnamese. I say, if you're in a white dominant world, you are Chinese.
You're Chinese, yeah. You're just an East Asian. You all look the same.
And that's the problem. And Vietnamese also here is the same way. It's like, he's only going to hit undocumented immigrants, and we're not undocumented, right? We came here as refugees. But now we'll begin to see that the policy is not hitting just undocumented immigrants. In the first administration, they already began to try to get rid of green card holders and anyone who had violated something, even when you smoke marijuana and sell some weed when you're 17 and now you're electric engineer at 30 something, but because you were found guilty of selling weeds, you can get your U.S. citizenship. Well, you're eligible for deportation. So you could be working in a high-tech company and ICE will come in and take you out and arrest you.
Right. And send you to El Salvador.
Yeah. Vietnamese are very surprised by that because they're like, wait, but we're legit.
Yeah.
I said, it doesn't matter if you're legit or not. If he's going to bend the law, nobody's legit, right? Because he's going to go after naturalized citizens after that. There are cases where if you fill something out when you apply for U.S. citizenship and you say if you lie, you're eligible for prosecution. Well, a lot of Vietnamese lied about their age when they got here, as both people. Because if you're younger, you can go to high school and learn English. But if you're older, you have to go to work. So then even if you lie 2-3 years, so that you can go to city college and get your degree, whatever, that actually would, make you eligible for deportation because you violated some kind of law. I remember driving and got a ticket and had to go to a driver's school, just for punishment. And then I said, but I only drove 60 and it was 55 and the guy next to me was going 67, 68 faster than me. And he said, doesn't matter. The cop caught you. The teacher said that. Did you or did you not drive faster than 55? I said, yeah. And he said, well, that's why you're sitting here. And so you can see how the law can be so unbending and used against everyone if it wants to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a sobering thought. Let me ask you one last question about Vietnamese people in Vietnam, their attitude towards America. We've touched on this a little bit, but perhaps we can talk about it a little bit more. The younger generation, as far as I understand from my own experience and from your writing, tend to be quite pro-American. You tell a story, I can't remember if it was in an interview with you or in one of your books, about a young woman who works as a tour guide showing people the Viet Cong tunnels. Can you tell that story and then talk about how young people now in Vietnam are looking at America?
Well, it's called the Cu Chi Tunnel. It's very famous back then because the U.S. government military was spending a lot of time looking for that tunnel because that's where the headquarters of the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese Communist Army was located. But it was so well hidden underground that despite all the effort, they couldn't find it. And it turned out to be just like a little hole on the ground and it's in water. So then you couldn't even find it because all the dogs cannot sniff past water. So then it was forgotten until the Vietnam vets come back and asked Vietnam about it. And they said, well, it's been abandoned. We won. So why would we keeping it? And then a light bulb went up. It's like, wait a minute, this could be a great tourist trap. So then it got expanded because it's too small. So Americans couldn't crawl through. And so it became a big, big hole in the ground so that Americans...
They had to expand the tunnel to let American tourists in.
Let Americans go through it. You know how thin Vietnamese are.
Yeah.
And so it's like a different tunnel, and the young woman was born after the war, so she wouldn't know about it, except for she spoke English really well, so she became the translator and tour guide. And so when she saw me, and she's like, oh, where are you from? She's like, oh, I love Disneyland. And I was like, huh. Here she was like just reciting communist propaganda, how they want the war, and this is how they hide and all that. You would think that she's very patriotic, but like on the side, it's like, oh, I saved so much money. I just want to buy a ticket to go to see Disneyland when I have a chance. And I thought that's a kind of neat story about war and its aftermath is that people cry at the tunnel and other people only saw a chance to go to Disneyland. And that's the thing about it is that the Americans are so full of centrality about everything. So 40 years, 50th year anniversary, they go to Vietnam as journalists and say, what do you think of the war? And most Vietnamese will say, which one? Because for us, there was only one war, American involved in Vietnam, right? Vietnam had 5 in the last century. And they fought against the French, they fought against the American, they fought against each other. They fought against China in 1979 when they took over Cambodia and they occupied Cambodia. You know, a lot of people died there. And Vietnam was definitely an aggressor during that time because they took over Cambodia for 10 years. To the Vietnamese, the point of view is that we had 5 wars. So when you say the war, you have to specify. But for us, it's like, oh, they must hate us because we bombed them. And nothing can be further from the truth because no one remembers that anymore unless you're like 70. And on the other hand, you have Vietnamese-Americans sending money home all these years, you know, like remittances is like 14 billion a year, you know?
Wow.
And so people are benefiting from the connection to America. And people who went to America became engineers and lawyers and doctors and businessmen and startup billionaires. And so they see going to America as a way to transform themselves. Whereas Americans go to Vietnam, it's like, oh my God, do they hate us? So it's it's like April 30th. Liberation, is it National Defeat Day? And it's like, depends on what story you are telling.
Wow. Well, on that note, Andrew, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation. It's really a joy talking to you.
Thank you.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, together with Maria Repnikova. The show is edited by Kadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yun Fei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you so much, Andrew. What a joy to talk to you.
Thank you.